Thanks, Keith. It's a pleasure to be here. Sam back there made a comment about he wasn't the oldest guy in the room. I may be the oldest guy in the room. And throughout that long, enjoyable life, I've been really interested in decisions and how decisions get made and how data affects decisions and hopefully improves decisions. And that kind of drives the remarks I'm going to make today. And that emphasis on decisions started out on an Iowa farm where every now and again my dad would grab my brother and I and start talking about if you guys would just work a little harder, we could get 10 more sows. And he would literally take his pencil and start writing on the barn, on the wall in the barn, and calculate the budget for if we would just work a little harder, we could be better off. So early on I got some exploration at least of budgets and some data. And then we had our first panel today talking about census of agriculture, which reminded me of being a college junior. And I got this wonderful internship with an ag economist named Earl Hetty, and I thought, wow, this is really great. And I then spent the next summer taking data from the census of agriculture, writing it down on something called coding sheets, which most of you don't know what I'm talking about, and then key punching it in, and then verifying it by key punching it twice to move forward. So data has always been important. Today, and we're talking about big data, but really in agriculture, in food and agriculture, a lot of good decisions are going to get made in the next decade or two with data. And it's not going to be big data the way our previous speaker talked about it, but it's data. And it's going to be using analytics. We need to know the difference, I think, between big data and using data. But a lot of our good decisions we're going to be making in the future is about how do we deal with data that we've not had before. And whether we use big data analytic techniques or whether we use Excel and a spreadsheet, the issue is, are we making better decisions? And there we go. So I'll talk just a minute about precision ag, sort of in a rear view mirror, and what can we learn about that for moving forward, talk a bit about the dimensions of big data and where some of those dimensions we've heard about particularly relate to agriculture, food systems. And then I want to talk about value and value and the drivers for big data adoption. And let's talk about precision ag. This is a picture of precision agriculture. Shoot, I gave away the date because I was going to ask, when do you think this was created? This was created in 1996. 1996, a group of farmers, agribusiness managers, and researchers in Champaign, Illinois got intrigued. Actually, we started this in about 1993. We got intrigued with these things called precision agriculture, and then this really strange thing called the internet. And what the heck would you do? So we would get together once a month, and the Farm Bureau would, we'd meet at the Farm Bureau office if they brought donuts. Otherwise, we'd meet on campus. And we just kind of worked this out, and this is our picture. And the interesting thing is, that pretty much looks like today. One of the things we missed was we didn't think about livestock. And I'm intrigued, and I'm going to be talking at an animal health conference in a few weeks, why we aren't moving farther in livestock systems than we seem to be, or are they moving very rapidly and it's just we don't know about it, which could be. But we learned, this picture was very good, and a lot of that has happened. I'm going to show you a rate of adoption, and I don't want you to think about the detail. This is variable rate technologies, their application in the Midwest U.S. and Southeast U.S., and this is created by the Center for Agribusiness at Purdue University, Erickson and Widmer. Every 2 years they do a survey of dealers, retailers, people who apply inputs to assess the amount of the market area being affected by variable rate applications. And the important point is if you look sorry, I got to run over here. You look here and you look here, we hope to get to 51% on these variable rates. So this technology has been around for at least 20 years. We did not get instantaneous adoption, and I think that's a message as we think about other applications and applications of big data, that ag applications don't necessarily follow the same rate we see with Google and Amazon and consumer goods, okay? Interestingly, if I had the chart of adoption of auto steer on new equipment, I'm told it would look very different because it's embedded in the technology. These involve somebody making decisions, farmers and agribusiness managers making decisions differently than they did before, much slower adoption rate than auto steer. Back when I had the previous picture up, we talked about auto steer, and we agreed that was just the stupidest idea you could ever bring forward to a farmer trying to sell him a John Deere tractor. What Illinois farmer in his right mind would give up the ability to steer the tractor? I mean, come on. But we learned that we didn't see the value. We didn't see the value proposition, and there is a value proposition, and the auto steer has been adopted fairly rapidly on new equipment, at least when prices were good. So what we've learned from precision ag is that we can expect in decision-making kind of characteristics maybe more evolutionary than revolutionary rates of adoption, because it's hard to do. Precision agriculture is hard to do. Working out in the field or working in the hog confinement barn is hard, dirty work, and your machines don't always work. And the idea that you need to calibrate that combine every morning before you push it into that field of corn, sometimes my brother just doesn't get the message, and we just go. And that's the reality we live in. We thought looking at maps would give us a lot of insights, and after we found the fence row that was no longer there, trying to look over 7 or 8 maps, layers of maps, for nitrogen application, weather, yield. It's very hard for the human mind to make any sense out of that, and you say, well, let's continue as we have before. Let me jump ahead. I said about success can be unanticipated. One of the interesting things is I talk to farmers and agribusiness managers. They still believe. They believe the belief that persist in what we would call the Internet of Things and the potential for it to help them improve decisions if it creates value. So let's look at some dimensions of big ag. Our previous speaker was going to have a similar list, but I want to focus on kind of ag applications that we're seeing happen. I only have 3 V's, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. Volume, we think about, again, large amounts of data. If we start to think about continuous application, continuous sensing, I have a friend in California who manages 100,000, if I say what kind of nut, that would give away the firm, but trees that produce nuts, 100,000 trees. His goal with big data is to manage every tree based on sensor observations from every tree and irrigation that includes fertilization on every tree. He will be generating large volumes of data at a daily basis. And he may learn that sensing every hour is a waste of time. He may learn that he needs to sense every 10 minutes. We don't know. He doesn't know what he doesn't know. But that's a lot of data that's got to get stored somewhere and got to get analyzed. His company spends $40 million a year on advertising. He has a budget that will allow him to bring in analytical capabilities to assess that data as he acquires it. Velocity, we think about speed of adoption. We think about monitoring confinement facilities for livestock and wanting to know when that fan stops, particularly if it's a hot day, and knowing when we can expect that fan to stop. I have a friend, Bob, who's working, he's what you'd call your typical large family farm in the Midwest. He's working with a large seed company, and they're trying to figure out how can they use weather data to determine when he should side dress nitrogen. Today we tend to apply all the nitrogen before planting, and some good portion of that nitrogen doesn't get used by the plant, and unfortunately it goes into river systems, and then bad things happen. If we could do more effectively with side dressing, which means we wait until the crop has emerged and we inject nitrogen right into the soil when the crop is there and needs it, we could reduce the waste, we could reduce the environmental impact. But you have to worry a lot about if the weather's bad and you don't get into side dress, you're not fertilizing your crop. So can we make that happen? And then, so he needs to know on a timely basis where on his 7,000 acres he should be farming side dressing today versus a week from now. So some notion of real time and velocity. And variety. lots of different kinds of information. I'm working with the with NGREC, National Great Rivers Research and Education Center, and our National Computer Center, and we're looking at rivers. And in the Midwest, we have about 17,000 devices in rivers capturing data. Now that's spread out over tens of thousands of miles, millions of acres. But we're getting continuous observation that we're bringing into our supercomputer, trying to bring it together and make it more decision relevant. We're also working with a private company that does satellite observations. Because could we, with satellite observations, which happen once in a while but are continuous across the area, could we create a virtual network monitoring, a virtual river monitoring network by bringing these two very different kinds of, actually many different kinds of data together and make sense of it? I'm going to argue variety is the most interesting thing about data in agriculture and about big data in agriculture. Data isn't what we think, certainly what I envision. We can think about financial transactions, which we used to think of as data. Turns of a screw in a manufacturing process is data. Your eyes as you read the screen could be data. Conversation on cell phones is data. So let's look at some ag data sources today. Over in the left-hand corner, we see a nice spreadsheet, undoubtedly better than what I generated as a lad in the 1960s. Over here, we have a field of grass growing in New Zealand. In New Zealand, dairy is very important, a very important industry. The main source of nutrition for the cows is grass. Relatively little grain is fed to cows, producing cows in New Zealand. And over the growing season, there's need for additional fertilization. And so and these cows are in the pasture all the time. These are not, as would be similar in, say, California, where the cows are in a feedlot, the cows are out grazing. And you kind of get an indication that that natural source of fertilization is random, a little bit haphazard. And so you want to apply fertilizer there, so you just say, I need 50 pounds or whatever it might be, and I'm going to do that on average, meaning I'll be wrong almost all the time, right? So one of my friends has developed a sensing bar on the front of his applicator where he measures the grass, the greenness of the grass, and other things, and at the back of the machine he applies a fertilizer based on what it says, what the fertilizer will need will be as the machine moves forward. So real-time observation, but grass, the real point of this I want to make, grass growing is data, okay? Grass growing in the field can be data. Left-hand side is cell phones. I'm going to make the assertion that the impact of sensing and data technologies in developing countries will be much more relatively important in agriculture there than it is in the U.S. because the systems there are so weak for gathering data. Here is another way to capture yield data. This is the International Rice Research Institute and the European Satellite Consortium, who think they will be able to assess yields in developing country rice production from satellite observations. So nobody walking out in the field, none of the statistical frames that we heard about, satellite observation. So data today is fundamentally different. This is a picture of me. I didn't really drive a tractor when I was 4. I waited till I was 8. The building in the back is that barn where my dad would write all his observations, and if the tornado hadn't come along, we could go and see all the history of the Sonka farm. The point of that is we had about 20 cows in there, and when we milked the cow and we carried the pail over to the bigger bucket, we kind of knew who was producing a lot, and we were taught that cow gets a little extra grain. Those cows that are ending their lactation, their production's going down, they don't get so much. So we had a measurement system that we could respond to. The other building right behind the tractor is the chicken house. We had about 100,000 hens in there. And we could have tried to measure, we could have developed technology to measure the production of every hen, just like we sort of did with every cow. But that would have been silly because the economics didn't matter. So measurement, and I'm going to argue measurement is a real key and a real changer here relative to data in agriculture and big data in agriculture. Measurement is an economic activity conditioned by technology. Technology is changing. That creates a lot of opportunities and challenges around our data. So one message, think about low-cost data. And the sensors that are being developed potentially on a per byte are very cheap. But as somebody mentioned, the systems can be very expensive. And I think this is the big deal of data in ag. This is the big deal of big data in ag. Analytics, I didn't put up veracity, because when you put up veracity, ag economists tend to think the data has to be accurate. Okay? Well, with big data and some of the techniques, the old expression garbage in, garbage out doesn't really have to always be true. And that sometimes garbage in cannot necessarily be garbage out. Sorry, I just went too far. So I'm going to go through a little experiment here for my friend, who's computer science professor, Tarek Abdul-Zahar, and I get points for being able to pronounce his name. He did a little experiments with his students. So on our college campus, like everywhere else, parking is intensely important. And he walked in one day to his class of 30 students and said, here's a map of the campus. Tell me which parking lots you can park in after 5 o'clock and not have to pay the meter. Now, we're talking about really important information here. These kids, some of them didn't have cars, some of them parked every day. This data is crap. I mean, it's just you'd never do it, but he did this for a reason, to show us something. He got the observations, some 900 observations over 100 parking lots. And if you just count, you get about 20% false positives, 23% false negatives, so this is like flipping a coin. How many of you would bet $1,000? I have a coin in my pocket, one of the pockets, a quarter. How many would you bet $1,000 that if we flip this, it'll come up heads? You're ag economists, none of you would. In the 80s, we held a meeting in Reno. The urban myth was that after the meeting, the casino operator said, don't ever let those people come back. Tarek does some machine learning type observations, and the data didn't change. There was no new information. He was able to get to about 7% false positives and about 10% false negatives. How many would you bet? How many of you would bet $1,000 if you knew the coin would come up heads 80% of the time? That's pretty good. As long as I can do a large number of bets, that's a pretty good bet. The data didn't change. The data didn't. So we talked about machine learning. This is letting the data tell us more than just yes and no. How did he do it? We'll go through this quickly, but there'll be a quiz. He used a maximum likelihood estimation approach. We have expectation maximization, an expectation step. Hopefully some of you know what this means, a maximization step, and then we iterate. Very sophisticated analytics to let the data tell us more than just yes and no. And that's really important because most of the data we're going to collect in ag, much of the data isn't going to be perfect. It isn't going to be perfect, but with analytics, we can move beyond perfect to get insights and useful decisions, which leads to what? And I'm getting signals here, but I want to run through this. There is a relatively popular book in the big data world that says society will need to shed some of its obsession with causality in exchange for simple correlation. Not knowing why, but only what. Overturn centuries of established practices and challenges our most basic understanding of how to make decisions and comprehend. So remember, our previous speaker talked about we're changing the model. You know, we used to go from hypothesis to data. Now we're just going to look at data. That's what we need to do. And it will tell us what happened. What more should we need? Simple example. Japanese eat very little fat, have fewer heart attacks than Brits or Americans. French eat a lot of fat, have fewer heart attacks than Brits or Americans. Italians drink expensive red wine, have fewer heart attacks than Brits or Americans. Japanese drink very little red wine, have fewer heart attacks than Brits or Americans. Germans drink a lot of beer and sausage. You just love the Germans. Suffer fewer heart attacks than British or Americans. So what's the point of this? We know what? No. You can eat what you want. It's English that kills you. Yeah, that's what the Brits brought to us. So the point in agriculture is what isn't enough. And this, I think, is the real opportunity for us in agriculture is we've built modern agriculture on small data. stuff in the lab, we go to a plot, we go to a small plot, we go to a larger demonstration, and then, let's do it on 10 million acres. And it has done tremendously positive things. How do we marry, but we've never known what happened. When we're on that 10 million acres, how do we marry these things together in really good research ways? I mean, for the young people in the room, this is the real opportunity of linking these two things together in a systematic, positive way. So the last thing I want to talk about was value and drivers for adoption. And I'm going to just tell you what I was going to say. Let me back up. So we as economists talk about value creation, value capture. That only happens when there's adoption. What are the potential drivers for adoption of big data and data analysis in agriculture? One is regulation. When we regulate stuff, we create data. Once data gets captured digitally, it's free. It's free, essentially, nearly free for analysis. And that can lead to, that has led in the world of information, led to lots of surprises. Second thing we'll point out, is that big data is real big data is being used throughout the sector. It's being used at the upward side in genetics, bioinformatics, and it's being used at the consumer side. How are those forces going to drive the need to capture more data and analyze it in the production sector, the farm sector, and those entities around it? And I think that will be a major driver. The third driver will be farm profitability. If I had to, I would predict that farm profitability in the next decade will be the least important of those three drivers, because it's hard. There are applications of logistics. There are some very of what we might call ERP that don't really require big data but require data. We're going to be seeing those driven by farm profitability. But as we think, as I think about it at least, the drivers in the immediate future, the next decade or so, are not going to be so much farm profitability as it is sector profitability or things driven by regulation. So cost of measurement is key to adoption of data and analytics and big data. So think about cost. And then I think we need to be spending, as ag economists, spending more time on how to link together our small data knowledge with what we're going to be observing, and that's what's happening. And then finally, we need to be thinking about what's going to drive adoption and how that may change as we move forward. So with that, I'll conclude and look forward to questions. Thank you very much.